He saw a black man in a clean suit driving a nice car and thought he found his next victim. But what he didn't know was that the man he pulled over wasn't just anyone. He was a high-ranking FBI agent. And by the time this stop ended, the officer's entire world flipped upside down. It was a warm afternoon in Georgia, and FBI agent Marcus Hayes was driving home after a long and exhausting meeting in downtown Atlanta. Dressed neatly in a tailored navy blue suit with his FBI badge clipped inside his jacket, Marcus looked calm and focused behind the wheel of his black Chevrolet sedan. His mind was still on the case files he had reviewed earlier that day, and he was planning to stop for coffee before heading home. As he turned onto a quiet suburban street, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought the officer might be responding to an emergency and moved slightly to the side to let him pass, but the lights stayed behind him. Realizing he was being pulled over, Marcus quickly checked his speed. He wasn't speeding, hadn't run any lights, and his registration was up to date. Still, he pulled over calmly, lowered his window, and placed both hands on the wheel just like he'd taught others to do in situations like this. The officer, a young white man with a buzz cut and dark sunglasses, approached the car with a stiff, arrogant posture. Without a greeting or explanation, he barked, "License and registration." Marcus responded respectfully, "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer's lips curled into a small smirk. "You looked suspicious," he said coldly. Marcus felt a familiar sting in his chest, not from fear, but from frustration. He had dealt with this kind of treatment his entire life, despite his achievements, rank, and service to the country. Still, he remained calm and handed over his ID and paperwork. As the officer took them, he leaned in slightly to scan the back seat, clearly looking for something that wasn't there. Anything illegal, anything to justify the stop. But there was nothing except an FBI folder, a closed laptop, and a coffee thermos. The officer stepped back and asked where Marcus was headed and why he was in this neighborhood. Marcus gave polite answers, knowing exactly what was happening. It wasn't a traffic violation. It wasn't a mistake. It was a targeted stop based on how he looked, a black man in a nice car. And although he remained calm, he knew one thing for sure. This officer had just messed with the wrong person. Asterisk, as Marcus sat quietly in his car, the situation began to shift from strange to uncomfortable. The officer, still holding his ID, paced slowly around the vehicle like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Marcus remained composed, but he could feel the tension rising. He had been trained for this kind of moment, not just as an FBI agent, but as a black man in America. He had learned long ago that even when you're in the right, how you respond could mean the difference between going home or not. The officer circled back to the driver's side window, now questioning Marcus more aggressively. "What do you do for a living?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing. Marcus didn't flinch. "I work in federal law enforcement," he replied simply. The officer raised an eyebrow and gave a fake chuckle. "Sure you do," he muttered. "Mind stepping out of the car?" Marcus hesitated for a second. There was no reason for a search. He hadn't done anything wrong, and the officer had yet to state a single legal cause for the stop. But Marcus knew how these situations could spiral, especially with ego involved. Calmly, he asked, "Am I being detained?" The officer's expression tightened. "I'm giving you a lawful order," he said. "Step out of the car." Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he reached slowly into his inside jacket pocket, keeping both hands visible, and pulled out his credentials. The badge shone clearly in the sunlight, followed by the ID card that said in bold letters, "Federal Bureau of Investigation." For a moment, everything stopped. The officer's eyes widened. His posture changed instantly from cocky to unsure. "You're FBI?" he asked, voice cracking slightly. Marcus looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, Special Agent Marcus Hayes. And now I'll ask again, what's the reason for this stop?" The officer stumbled over his words, suddenly nervous, trying to explain that it was a routine check. But Marcus knew it wasn't. There had been nothing routine about it. The smirk was gone. The attitude was gone. All that remained was an officer who had just realized he'd made a huge mistake. Marcus didn't raise his voice or threaten. He simply stood tall, cool, and silent. Because now, the real power was in his hands. The air around them grew heavy. For a few seconds, there was silence between Agent Marcus Hayes and Officer Daniels. The badge had done its job. It had exposed the truth. The officer realized instantly that this wasn't just another stop where he could intimidate someone into silence. But instead of admitting fault or apologizing, Daniels doubled down. "Just doing my job," he mumbled, trying to sound firm again. Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply stared at the officer, letting the weight of the situation settle. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. How many times had this happened to others who didn't have a badge to protect them? Marcus knew his calm presence was rattling Daniels, and the officer, perhaps feeling cornered, shifted his stance and rested his hand near his holster. It wasn't a direct threat, not yet, but it was a warning. Marcus saw it clearly. This was a power move. One last attempt to remind him who controlled the street, even if only for a moment. "Sir, I need you to cooperate," Daniels said, his tone sharper now. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "I've given you everything you asked for. You still haven't told me why you pulled me over." The officer avoided eye contact now, clearly searching for an excuse that didn't exist. "You were driving a little slow back there," he said, almost hoping Marcus would buy the lie. But Marcus wasn't interested in arguing. He was recording everything now, calmly holding his phone to document the interaction. He knew that even with a badge, things could go wrong. As a black man, he had lived his whole life preparing for this kind of moment. "Do you realize the seriousness of what you're doing right now?" Marcus asked him, keeping his voice steady. "You profiled me, pulled me over without cause, and now you're trying to backtrack because you saw a badge. Imagine if I didn't have it. Would I still be standing here? Or would I be in cuffs, or worse?" The words hit hard. Daniels didn't respond. The traffic stop that started with arrogance and power had now turned into silence and shame. Marcus put his badge back in his jacket and said firmly, "This isn't over. Expect to hear from my office." Then he calmly returned to his car, leaving the officer standing on the roadside, shaken, exposed, and suddenly very aware of what justice really looked like. As Marcus drove away from the scene, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, not out of fear, but out of restraint. He had dealt with hostility before, but this time felt different. The way the officer had looked at him, spoken to him, and treated him without reason stirred something deeper. Marcus wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about the young black men who didn't have badges, who couldn't flash credentials to make the abuse stop. By the time he got home, he had already written a detailed report and attached the dashcam footage from his own vehicle, along with the recorded conversation on his phone. He didn't write it out of revenge. He wrote it because accountability mattered. The next morning, Agent Hayes walked into the local FBI field office, calm and professional as always. He handed the report to his supervisor, who read it in silence, and simply nodded, knowing this would go straight to internal affairs. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels sat at his desk, nervously replaying the interaction over and over in his mind. His confidence from the day before had crumbled completely. He thought the stop would be forgotten, just another incident swept under the rug, but this one was different. He had pulled over a man who not only knew the law he helped enforce it. Later that week, the department received the formal complaint and Daniels was called in. As he sat across from his chief, body cam footage playing behind them, he squirmed. Every moment of his arrogance, every baseless question, every lie he told, all of it was caught on camera and now under scrutiny. The chief didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply asked, "What exactly did you see that made you think Agent Hayes was suspicious?" Daniels had no answer, because there wasn't one. Back at the FBI office, Marcus wasn't celebrating. He knew this wasn't about punishing one man. It was about revealing a much deeper problem. He spoke with a small group of new recruits later that day, sharing the story as a real-life lesson. "Always be calm, but never be silent," he told them. "Respect the badge, but never let it blind you." He knew that true justice didn't just happen in courtrooms. Sometimes it started on the side of the road. The situation landed squarely on Officer Daniels. A formal letter from the FBI's Internal Affairs Division was delivered to the local police department, requesting immediate review of the officer's conduct during the traffic stop involving Special Agent Marcus Hayes. The police chief, already aware of the issue, had no choice but to act quickly. Daniels was pulled off duty and placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Meanwhile, Marcus remained silent publicly but active behind the scenes. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that true accountability takes more than emotion. It takes process, evidence, and pressure in the right places. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility had already flagged Daniel's stop as a civil rights concern, and when they began reviewing his past records, things got even worse. Daniels had a pattern several previous stops involving Black and Latino drivers, many of which were undocumented or dismissed in court. None of them had the power to push back. Until now, the department's legal team requested all body cam footage, dispatch recordings, and even reviewed Daniel's past 6 months of citations. What they found wasn't just one bad day, it was a pattern of behavior. At the same time, word of the incident quietly spread through the FBI network, where agents, both senior and new, expressed frustration and support for Marcus. Though he never asked for attention, his calm handling of the situation had struck a nerve. He didn't just stand up for himself, one colleague said. He stood up for every one of us who's ever been judged before we could even speak. Daniels, now aware of the growing heat, tried to defend himself, claiming he was just following training, but even his fellow officers weren't buying it anymore. The investigation had become serious, and now the department was facing questions from the public and the press. A statement was released saying they were conducting a full and transparent investigation into the officers' behavior. But behind the scenes, Daniel's future in uniform was slipping fast. The call that changed everything wasn't just the one Marcus made to report the stop-it, was the call for justice that echoed through the ranks, reminding everyone that no one is above the law, and no badge can protect you from the truth. A few weeks after the initial complaint, Officer Daniels received the final verdict: termination for violating department policy and civil rights misconduct. There was no dramatized firing ceremony, just a formal letter and a badge. Turned in at the front desk, but to Marcus Hayes, it felt like a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by prejudice. Instead of dwelling on retribution, Marcus channeled the momentum into something bigger. He coordinated with the local police training academy to develop a new workshop on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics, offering his own time and expertise to speak directly to officers about the human impact of their split-second decisions. On a crisp morning in the same suburban neighborhood where his stop had occurred, Marcus stood before a group of officers in uniform, flashing only his badge for identification. He began by recounting the traffic stop, how a simple assumption had nearly spiraled into tragedy, and then turned it over to lessons learned. Respect isn't optional, empathy isn't weakness, and accountability is the cornerstone of trust. He shared data showing how unbiased policing methods reduce complaints and build community cooperation, weaving in personal anecdotes and legal standards in a way that resonated with every rank in the room. Some officers squirmed uncomfortably. Others looked down, embarrassed by what they had heard. But all listened. After the formal presentation, Marcus stayed late, talking one-on-one with officers who asked difficult questions and even admitted past mistakes. He didn't chastise them. He thanked them for having the courage to confront their own biases. By sunset, the training room was empty except for Marcus and the lead instructor, who shook his hand firmly and admitted, "You've changed the way we'll do things here." For Marcus, that was true justice, not the file cabinet full of complaints, or the firing of one bad actor, but a systemic shift in thinking. He drove home feeling hopeful, imagining a future where stops like his would become rarer, and when they did happen, officers would pause, reflect, and choose humanity over habit. That evening, as he set his badge on the shelf beside his family photos, Marcus realized the real power hadn't come from the gun or the badge itself, but from the choice to use both responsibly. And in that moment, he understood that justice wasn't simply a verdict, it was a promise to keep raising the bar for everyone who wears the uniform. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Subscribe to Deep Wounds for more powerful true stories that speak truth to justice.